Hello and welcome to Peripheral Vision for Lent of 2021. This is a Lenten reflection on the mystery of Moses. And I call it a mystery because the more I've been reflecting on Moses, he's proven himself to be rather elusive. In the Gospels, we have a deliberate attempt on the early church to be giving eyewitness testimonies to the life of Christ. Either John and Matthew themselves, or Mark and Luke, who are giving eyewitness testimonies to eyewitness testimonies. But in the life of Moses and the books about Moses, these are the first 5 books of the Bible, are written several hundred years after the life of Moses itself. They only come to us in their final form around the time of the return of the exile into Babylon. So the question is, what was going on the whole time? Why on earth do we not have a definitive witness from Moses' own lifetime? And so the answer has started gradually appearing to me is that Moses' importance only took generations for Israel to really understand. It took them a while to realize who they had in their midst. And it was the shock of understanding who Moses was that also prepared them for understanding one who'd be greater than Moses who is to come, to fulfill the mission that Moses had come to accomplish. And so Moses himself then is almost at the center of a peculiar mystery. How did Israel come to be? And by Israel, I mean the people of Israel, its people, its institutions, its religious life, its customs, and that if one were to be able to reason backwards into what were the institutions of Israel in the first century, always as you go back into its root, you find Moses at the center. And not only is Moses at the center if one reasons backwards into Israel's history, but also then all of history that was leading up into Moses also in the sense points to him in some sense in the Old Testament. And in fact, the first book of the Bible, the first book of Moses, the book of Genesis, is in fact more designed as a prologue to Moses' life. And so characterizing the life of Moses as a mystery, this then is what had me kind of go all the way back to one of the best mystery solvers in the world. Now, he's a fictional character. His name is Sherlock Holmes. And he had said this to his friend Watson in how to solve a mystery. I have already explained to you that what is out of the common is usually a guide rather than a hindrance. In solving a problem of this sort, the grand thing is to be able to reason backward. That is a very useful accomplishment and a very easy one, but people do not practice it much. In the everyday affairs of life, it is more useful to reason forward, and so the other comes to be neglected. There are 50 who can reason synthetically for one who can reason analytically. I confess, said Watson, that I do not follow you. I hardly expected that you would. Let me see if I can make it clearer. Most people, if you describe a train of events to them, will tell you what the result would be. They can put those events together in their minds and argue from that something that will come to pass. There are a few, however, who, if you told them the result, would be able to evolve from their own inner consciousness what the steps were that led up to that result. The power is what I mean when I talk of reasoning backward or analytically. Now, in his fancy schmancy way of describing it, what Sherlock Holmes is describing is to almost describe a crime scene. You see something, the result of an action. And by looking at the scene, then you figure out what would have been the necessary steps that would have led to the construction of that scene. And one of the principal patterns or ways in which to figure out why the scene is the way it is to figure out what was done and why it was done. And that then will give the entire layout of the story and often figure out and reveal who was the actor or who were the actors behind the stage. And so it was in the complexity of Israel's worship and practices and customs that the figure of Moses began to take shape. It's not as if he didn't exist, but gradually his significance became more and more clear because they had been telling the story of this man for centuries, but only as time progressed and they tried to imitate him that they realized how significant the figure of Moses truly was. And so before we can talk about Moses specifically, it's also good then to understand the first book of Moses and to, reason forward, as Sherlock would describe it, forward from the book of Genesis to lay the foundation for what will actually be why Moses is so unique. And we have to start, as Moses himself does, with the beginning. In the beginning, more specifically, where God creates the heavens and the earth. And it's important that you'll notice that throughout this narrative, you do already have the importance of dualities. God creates the heavens and the earth. God creates the land and the sea, the stars and the stars above, the lights above and the stars, and then the lights in the dark, the moon, etc. That God creates these little dualities, and both of them are built in pairs and are therefore meant to be complements to each other. So just as one must be able to reason analytically and synthetically, we also need to be able to see the beauty and the good of all things in creation and to see the limits of each one. That light is good, but so is dark. That the land is a great place to live, especially when you have feet. But that God also created the sea and all that is in them. And most terrifying and dangerous of all, God created us male and female, in his image and in his likeness. And when God says, let us create man and woman in our own image, he even uses the plural, which is quite mysterious to say the least. But what is God's motive? What's God's purpose in creating the universe to begin with? Well, it's important then to use the other principle that Sherlock mentions in that particular speech, to realize when you are dealing with an outlying piece of data, something that is beyond the normal, that is actually a better indication that something is important. And the primarily unique piece of Israel's story and Moses' story is that when God created in the story that Moses has given us in the book of Genesis, it is a free, creative, and loving act. In all the other ancient mythologies of creation, what you usually have is a deity of some sort who half exists but came into being at some point, usually, takes materials that already exist and then fashions the universe out of them. Now, oftentimes the materials that also exist are usually also around either because of happenstance or because of some kind of conflict. So in the case of the Babylonian mythology in specific, which the Jewish people were directly into conflict with, the gods are actually create the universe with the leftovers of the gods that they had defeated in warfare as a type of prison, that the entire human race and the cosmos is a prison for evil and somehow must be domesticated and controlled. In the case of the Greek mythos about the origins of the human race is created mostly because the gods are bored and need some attention. Almost like narcissistic children, the gods in Greece just want someone to admire them. But the God of Israel is not in that category. The God of Israel created the human race and created the entire cosmos almost for fun, on a lark, to not fulfill a need on God's part, because Israel and Moses make it abundantly clear that God has no needs, that all worship of the one true God doesn't help him. And so this then leads into an interesting paradox. Not only does God create male and female in his image, but the true way of worshiping him is represented in the next day, in the seventh day, which is in the Sabbath, which is in resting. which points to the double reality of the worship in Israel, that it is meant to bring balance to the two poles that God has created, and that the balance is maintained through restful trust. Now, we know how difficult it is to be at rest when it feels as if there's so much work that must be done. And so we can say, just one more, just one more, just one more, just one more. But the beauty of the covenant God giving in creation and saying, let there be rest, just as much as let there be light, God is saying, no, I don't need you to do anything. Your worship is to rest, to be at peace, to be still. Even if simultaneously God calls humanity to tend the earth and to care for it and to watch over it. And that we see particularly in the second creation story in Genesis chapter 2, the so-called Yahwist account. The first chapter is the so-called priestly account. The second account is called the Yahwist account, where God creates the man first, and then the man learns how to be able to share in God's stewardship over, God's care over creation through his role as a steward. But then the man realizes that he's alone. And it's in that solitude then that God creates a helpmate, a partner. And it's in that breaking of the breaking of the monomania of the one self into the fellowship that God makes one of the most profound statements in the Old Testament. It is not good for the man to be alone. So just as Sabbath trust is a way in which we live our relationship with God, it becomes also then the way in which we live our relationship with each other. That we're not mass producers, first for God, and second is we are at our richest with each other when we can be trusting with each other. Which is why where the entry of the serpent is such a pointed tragedy, because the serpent quite literally goes in the barrier between the man and the woman, and sows mistrust between the man and the woman and God, and ultimately between the man and the woman themselves. Because the serpent says to Eve, did God say that you should not eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Did God tell you the truth? Was God lying to you? God is trying to prevent you from being like himself. He wants to hold you back. He wants to prevent you from reaching your full potential. And like all lies, it has, in a sense, a smidge of truth in it. And this is where a criminal genius will really show their capacity. Because in reality, God did create us in his image. And yet God is preventing us from reaching that full blossoming. But is it because God is malicious, or is it because we are not ready yet? And just when we give in to the temptation to seek after knowledge and authority, to be able to bridge that gap of trust, that the whole thing falls apart. Adam and Eve eat from the fruit, and then in so doing realize that they're naked and cover themselves up from each other, and hilariously tried to hide themselves from God. Genius. You can imagine how well that will go in the long run. So they hide themselves from God, and God says, hey, why are you hiding? And they say, we heard you. We realized we were naked, and so we hid. Who told you that you were naked? She made me eat fruit. It was her fault. Why did you eat the fruit then? The serpent made me do it. Okay. So you can imagine then God then has to say to the serpent, what you have done, what you've done, I will undo. But on your belly you will go, and dust you will eat. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. You will strike at his heel, and he will crush your head. But he does declare to both the man and the woman, God both declares to the man and the woman, you will be at odds with each other and with creation until the end of time. Because this is the downside when trust is broken. Not only is trust broken, but you can't rebuild trust without trust. And so God can't, by a simple act of authority, restore them to Eden, which is why he also has to banish them from the garden. You can't live in a world of trust when you don't trust people. It has to, in a sense, be earned and re-earned with a greater act of hope. And that is something that Adam and Eve are just not capable of anymore. And so God isolates them from the tree of life. And as St. Ambrose comments, that it was likely to prevent them from living in that eternal condition of mistrust forever and for eternity. That God, in a sense, put a limit to life so that the sufferings and the travails of life would not continually pile on. Just as much for us that we need to learn the lesson and to be able to learn to trust God again. But immediately after their expulsion from the garden, Adam and Eve then know each other and have 2 sons. And we see the impact of their lack of trust in God and their lack of trust in each other then handed on to their children. As all people are called to do at all times, is to worship God, not because he needs it, but because we need to give him that worship. Cain and Abel both offer their worship unto God, and God accepts the sacrifice of Abel and disregards the sacrifice of Cain. This then leads Cain to resent his brother Abel and to harbor hostility to him in his heart. And we begin to see the nature of the problem starting to unfold, because on one level, Cain resents the fact that his brother's sacrifice is accepted, and yet his resentment points to why his sacrifice is not accepted. Because Cain is almost treating it as if it was a bargain or a competition for superiority, which that would only make sense if the worship of God was something that God needed, or something that God was using to test us with. So God asked Cain, "Why are you downcast? Don't you know that sin is at your door? And it's going to take you if you're not on your guard." Well, that truth is too much for Cain to bear. And so, rather than change his heart and change his ways, which may be too hard for Cain at this point, he doesn't kill the problem. He kills the occasion for him feeling the problem by killing his brother, and buries him and hides the blood. But again, if one knows the true and the living God, hiding your crimes from him is not really a smart idea. God says to Cain, "Where's your brother, Abel?" And Cain says, "What am I, my brother's keeper?" And God says, "I can hear his cries coming up from the earth." And God then declares that the punishment for such a murder is great, and that it has unleashed a deeper mistrust into the world. And upon realizing what he has done, Cain then cries and laments and says, "My punishment is too great for me to bear." And I don't think he has or ever will have said any more profound word than that. For very often, when we live in the world and play by the rules of the world, we accrue a punishment for ourselves that is far beyond our capacity to pay. And the question is why does God let it continue? And just as God provided clothes for Adam and Eve, in spite of the fact that awareness of their nakedness was the result of their own actions, God then protects Cain from the consequences of his actions, precisely because Cain's lament is true, that his punishment is too much for him to bear. So God says, "I will protect you with a mark." But that doesn't change Cain's heart either. his resentful bitterness then he hands on to his children, and his children then not only have clothes for themselves, but start clothing themselves in armor and weapons and industry and civilization, which are often the means by which we today, for instance, hide ourselves from the truth of ourselves. And then that only compounds the problem of sin, and it reaches a breaking point when a few generations later, as humanity is violating the earth, violating others with violence, and violating the covenant of marriage through polygamy, God then looks on his creation and regrets making humanity. It's an amazing statement in the book of Genesis that God can look on the world and regret having made it. But I think it points to something that is often present in our culture today when we ask ourselves, is life worth living? And the statement can easily be that God in his wisdom can agree with us if our life is simply ordered towards itself. And so God can look on the world with a kind of sorrow that is far more penetrating than any skeptic could ever claim to find. It's not as if these complaints against the faith are anything new or anything unknown. And in fact, the scriptures themselves go deeper than most doubters would even dare to begin to do. But God sees one small exception to the rule of the world, and that's Noah. Noah, who is the best of his generations, who is not a direct descendant of Cain. And God says that he will spare Noah and his family, and gives them advance notice of the oncoming flood that will wipe out all flesh of the earth. And God also tells Noah to put 2 by 2 of each of the animals on the ark so that they can restart the world, a great reboot or reset. And the flood happens and washes away the sins of Cain. At the end of the flood, as you know the story of the dove and the olive branch, Noah lands the boat, the animals get out, and he offers a sacrifice of some of the clean animals, and the sacrifice pleases God. Now, the text doesn't go into explaining whether or not that wound up in an extinction level event for 2 of the leftovers. We'll just let that one sit. But the sacrifice is so pleasing to God that God makes a covenant with Noah, a covenant that he will not destroy the earth. And this is a brilliant understanding of God's fidelity. That God, by his own honor, protects creation, not because creation has merited or that humanity has earned God's protection, but that God, by his own name, has decided to bring his creation to its fulfillment. And so the covenant to Noah seals God's work in creation. But the sad part is that the dangers that beset Cain and his descendants are still present and possible in the descendants of Noah. Very soon after, Noah and his family escaped the flood. Noah, one day, imbibes too much of the fruit of the earth and its fermentation, and finds himself intoxicated and asleep. And one of his children exposes the naked shame of Noah to the other children in a type of self-righteous mockery that reveals that it's not just vice and malice that can destroy us, but it's a kind of perverse enjoyment at the faults of those who have come before. And that can be just as much as a destructive power as anything else. And then that sin then exposes in us our willingness to engage in tyrannical power in order to remove that which makes us feel uncomfortable. So soon after this event, we have the story of Babel, which is humanity's attempt at total control and order in the world. And in an attempt to rise up the human race to the level of Godhead, we unify the world in one language, technology, and power and control. And God looks at the world and says, can't let that happen. I will go among them, destroy this tower, and confuse their speech, because they're trying to be like us. So God confuses their speech, and all of civilization breaks off and fragments. Now that might be God being petty and trying to prevent us from rising up. But as something that the Moses story will truly reveal, it's that when human power reaches its zenith, and our ability to be able to create order and control and stability, that's where the real tyrannies begin. And so it is somehow in this balance between the chaos of the sea and the safety of the land, between the chaos of the underworld and the dangers of the present life, that somehow God will find a balance and bring back to order that which he began in creation. But this will be a long-term plan. And just as God had to make a covenant with Noah to promise that he will not wipe out creation, he then also now had to redeem creation from within in order to reestablish his purpose. And so he picks one man from the whole world, from the Ur of the Chaldees, and takes him out of his land and says, Abram, leave the land of your fathers and go to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. Now, this pulling out of a single man from the world and then giving him a brand new foundation is the very foundation of the Hebrew story. Whereas now, moving away from the abstractions of a prehistorical mythos, now in the concrete reality of history, God is beginning to show his face and his purpose. And again, to what end? What on earth could God's intent be? Well, you can see sometimes a person's intent by their actions and their behaviors, because while God promises to give Abraham a great descendants and to prepare for him a brand new life, God's a little slow in the uptake. It takes God many, many years before he even allows Abraham to even entertain the thought of having a child. And this sort of elongation of trust kind of gives us an indication as to what God's motives are, that he's planning a long game. He's not taking the quick fix. He wants to be able to go into the whole of it. And so a lot of the subsequent story of Abram's life is actually going through a process of internal transformation, of learning how to trust God, learning how to trust the truth, learning how to be able to take God's will as it is revealed. And it ain't easy. He has fights with his family. He has tensions with other kings. He has to be able to defend his flocks. And sometimes the weight of responding in freedom to this call hurts so much that we kind of want a shortcut. And shortcut he seeks. Him and his wife Sarai, after spending too many years waiting for a child, decided to use one of their slave girls in order to have a child. Hagar is chosen by Sarai to be the mother of Abraham's new kid. And of course, sure enough, immediately after Hagar is pregnant and gives birth to Ishmael, there's now a tension between Sarai and Hagar, and Abraham kind of weakly in the middle of the two. And Sarai demands that Hagar be removed from the home, and so is Ishmael, revealing the inner hostility and animosity of a lack of monogamy. And Sarai, after having ejected Hagar is now left in the wilderness alone with her son. And God takes care of the child and takes care of the mother, almost out of a sense of responsibility for the actions that he had set in motion, even if he was not the one that told Sarah and Abraham to do it. And that they had to realize that you can't force God's hand. God wanted a free child to be born. And it needed to be a choice and an active response on their part, not simply of the flesh, but of the heart and of the desire. Not because we were compulsed, but because it's what we want to do. Sure enough, a little while later, Abraham sees 3 men. And according to the ancient laws of hospitality, decides to give them food and shelter. But doesn't just decide to, wants to. He begs them to actually let him show them hospitality. Upon fulfilling his act of generosity, the men reveal themselves to be angels of the Lord and say, "You will indeed have a son." And it is so. Abraham has his firstborn son and names him Isaac. But the gift must also follow the motive. When God created the universe, he did so freely as an act of generous love. And he created us in his image in order that we can respond in that free and total gift of ourselves. And in Abraham, we see the limit of how much humans can give. And God makes that clear to Abraham when one day he says to Abraham, "Abraham, Abraham." And Abraham replies, "Here I am." "Abraham, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and offer him to me on this mountain." So Abraham dutifully responds to the Lord's summons and prepares to offer his son on Mount Moriah, nearby Salem. And walking up the mountain, you can get the impression that Abraham has not told his son Isaac that he will be the offering, he will be the sacrifice. And then Isaac notices something's up, says, "Hey, Dad, got a question for you. Where's the lamb? You know that we've got all this stuff for a sacrifice, but we've got no sacrifice to offer." And Abraham says, "God himself will provide the sacrifice." And that is a powerfully true line that Abraham didn't even know how true it was. For just as he was about to kill his own son, God said through Abraham, "Stop. Now I know that you would not withhold your son, your only son, whom you love, from me. So instead, make a different sacrifice." Abraham notices a ram caught in the thicket and offers the sacrifice in place of his son. And thus begins a process of sacrificial offerings in Israel, where you offer a gift that represents the heart. Because to give the heart itself would burn us up as an offering that is too much for us to bear. And sadly, it is true on more than one level. Because from this point on, Abraham sort of disappears from the story. And then Isaac jumps in. And the next relevant part of the story, at least for now, is his old age, because he now himself has had 2 sons. One is named Esau and the other one is Jacob. They're twins. Esau was the firstborn, the strong, powerful hunter, whom Isaac favors. And then the secondborn, Jacob, whom his mother Rebekah favors. And the tragedy of their story is the tension and the animosity between the 2 brothers. That is a reflection of the tension between the parents. And one day, while he was hungry, Esau noticed that his brother had some food, and Jacob said to Esau, "I will only give you some food if you give me your inheritance." And Esau thinks, "Well, what good is my inheritance if I'm hungry and dying? So give me the food." And he promises his inheritance to Jacob. But in such a world, you can't take back such a gift. You can't take back such a reality. One's word is one's identity. And that even if no one was there but those two, the Lord God had seen what had happened. And the way in which Esau is willing to throw away his birthright in order to get some food is an indication as to what will happen to him later. Nearing the end of Isaac's life, he realizes he's about to die and says to his son Esau, "Find an animal, kill it, and bring me the food, and then I will give you a blessing," which is ancient speak for inheritance. And Isaac's wife, Jacob's mom, hears the story and says to Jacob, "Go and dress up like your brother, put on his clothes, put some skins on yourself to give yourself some hair, because your brother's much hairier than you, and I will prepare for you the meal, and you will take the blessing." So Jacob goes to his father Isaac, prepares the food, and Isaac says, because he can no longer see, "You sound like Jacob, but you feel like Esau." He eats the food, gives the blessing to Jacob, and it's upon Jacob receiving the blessing meant for Esau that Esau returns and the deception is made clear. Isaac now knows he's been played. Esau is heartbroken and breaks into tears and begs his father for the blessing. And Isaac, having recognized that this is a ratification of some element of the divine will, gives his son Esau a blessing as well, but not the blessing of the firstborn, but one of service to his elder brother, his younger brother, but now elder brother. And in his heartbreak, Esau vows to kill his son, his brother, Jacob. So Jacob has to run because he's mom's favorite and Esau is the hunter. So you can imagine how that fight would have gone. So Jacob runs and finds himself in an exile. And it's in exile that he falls in love and wants to marry one of Laban's daughters. And Laban says, "Yes, I'll give you my daughter in marriage." So Jacob does all the work that is expected of him. And then Laban gives the old switcheroo and gives him a different daughter. And the thought is, "Hey, he deceived me." Of course, the irony is kind of lost on Jacob for now. It happens again, and it happens again. And it's only after a while that Jacob finally figures out, oh, there's something about me that I'm missing. I'm the deceptive one. I'm the cheat. I'm the one who, took him a while to figure it out, but at least he figured it out. So ultimately, what happens is that Jacob, in the middle of the night, discovers in a dream that he is, in a sense, a middle point of a ladder between God and humanity. And in another vision, Jacob has a wrestling match with an angel or with God. And having prevailed in his wrestling match with God, Jacob has his name changed to Israel. And quite literally becomes the founding father of Israel. And his 12 sons would become the 12 tribes of Israel. But the old problems still come back. His favorite son, Jacob, Israel's favorite son, is the son of his favorite wife. Monogamy is important. And the other brothers know that Joseph is daddy's favorite. Many of them have already lost their inheritance due to some internal family conflicts. And the prime son job has now descended to Judah himself. But Joseph is still the favored one. And he starts having this habit of having dreams. And one such dream that Joseph wisely tells his brothers is that one day all of them would bow down before him. Well, you can imagine how much they like that. Not simply that, but also that he started dressing around and then saying, "Look at this coat that Dad gave me. See how much better I am than you?" Well, it looks like Jacob had learned nothing from his experience with Esau and, the tensions of brothers. And when you multiply 1 to 12, it becomes slightly problematic. Actually, 1 to 11, sorry. It becomes slightly problematic. So the brothers start hatching a plot to kill their brother. Here comes the dreamer, they say. But Judah and a few of the others are a little uncomfortable with killing their brother outright. So they think, well, what's the next best thing that we can do to shut him up and to not deal with him anymore? Well, let's sell him into slavery. Let's make some money in the process. Let's sell him into slavery and then just tell Dad that a wild animal killed him. So that's what they do. They sell Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, to a group of Ishmaelite slave traders and then make off with the money. Notice the Ishmaelites. Sins of the fathers always come back. So now Joseph is cut off from his family and from his father and finds himself a slave in Egypt. Now he still has this tendency of having remarkable dreams. And these dreams bring him up and down through the echelons of power in Egypt. And while in jail, for a series of events that I won't go into now, but are really quite hilarious and interesting, he is able to warn Pharaoh of Egypt about an upcoming famine. And he tells the Egyptian Pharaoh to prepare for that famine by stockpiling food so that when the dark day hits, then they'll be ready for it. Of course, it definitely has echoes of the Noah story, is that those who know that the world is always on the brink of teetering are usually the best prepared. And sure enough, the famine comes, and Egypt is ready to handle the problem. And not only is it ready and able to handle the problem, but it can also then protect and help the nations and the kingdoms that are around it. And so Egypt then rises in prominence. And then while Joseph's brothers in the land of Canaan are hungry, he seems to be doing all right. So the rest of the 11 brothers and their father now make a mission to Egypt asking for help and asking for food. And sure enough, they come and meet Joseph, but can't recognize him, who is now seated in the highest seat of power in Egypt, save for the Pharaoh himself. And he recognizes his brothers asking for help and thinks, now I've got you. So he says to them, bring before me your little brother, and maybe I'll help you. And they're like, oh, that's no good. We kind of got rid of him. And now our sins are coming back to bite us. How are we going to handle this? And eventually, I would suggest you just read the story yourself. Joseph is overcome by noticing that his brothers had changed and that they had realized that they were in the wrong, and is also so heartbroken at the fragility of his father that Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers, provides them reprieve and food in Egypt, and helps create a period of prosperity in Egypt's life. Joseph and his brothers and their father then finished their years in Egypt. And as the beginning of the book of Exodus will point out, and then there came a Pharaoh who remembered not Joseph. It's a long and winding road that brings creation into fulfillment and God's choosing of a family to be the carrier of his promises, and then to be airlifted out due to trial into Egypt, and then precisely because of the power and the success that the Hebrew people, the sons of Jacob, experience in Egypt, precisely then becomes the means of their oppression, shows the subtlety and the nuances of the Genesis story and the very foundations of the story of Moses. Because Moses and the entire covenants of Israel are complex. There's no simple good and bad, right and wrong, because among the sons of Adam, there is no perfect hero. But the sons of Adam, sons of Isaac, Jacob, and Israel above all, their purpose is, through their virtues and their faults, to make God's action more visible in the world. And it will be Moses, who knows God as a friend, who sees him face to face, who will make the mystery of God clearer. And so the purpose of Moses, the purpose of all the scriptures, is by experiencing the mystery of humanity, we will come to appreciate the mystery of God and to figure out what life really means. God bless you. See you during Lent.